every day was different. That's the beauty of journalism and newsrooms that are vibrant, filled with interesting characters, people that you couldn't make up. This kinds of fantastic, curmudgeonly and excitable and just really fascinating, hard-working, sometimes drunken folk in newsrooms, and I just loved it, and I just felt so privileged to be getting paid at the same time. With Lynn Dawson, I was really confident we were looking at a case of cold-blooded murder by her husband, and it became a podcast series called The Teacher's Pet, released over several months in the second half of 2018. And just as the 16th episode was dropping after this exhausting period of investigation and production, the police came to the Gold Coast and arrested Chris at his investment property at Runaway Bay, and he was taken to Sydney charged with murder after several years of pretty grueling legal process where my podcast and my interviews and my contact with a lot of the people, the defence lawyers wanted to try to demonstrate that I had contaminated witnesses, that he could never get a fair trial and therefore should never face one. The High Court ruled out his bid to evade justice, and Chris Dawson went to trial in 2022, and at the end of August of that year he was found guilty of murder, and he's received a term of life imprisonment, and he's been convicted again of carnal knowledge with an underage schoolgirl. And Chris Dawson, this was a teacher who had taught on the northern beaches of Sydney and then went to the Gold Coast, and within weeks of me having left Keebra Park State High, he was at my old school teaching some of my old friends who had repeated, and he was there. And it was one of the reasons I first wanted to look at that case in 2001, and I'm so glad that I picked it up again and revisited it for the podcast 16, 17 years later. And when you do make that difference, it's so profound and much more satisfying than anything else. I'm 56 and I feel like I've been given another decade at least of being useful as an investigative journalism because of the podcast genre and the fact that amazingly people want to listen to me, sometimes droning on for as long as 20 hours in a series. There have been more than 100 million downloads of my podcast now around the world and of course across Australia. And who would have thought that an old newspaper hack from the Gold Coast could have got such numbers? But they hear the truth. They hear the sounds of people who are grief-stricken, who are hopeful, who are waiting for something to happen, something in what's often a live podcast investigation that will turn things right around and possibly deliver an outcome that'll lead to a killer being finally brought to justice.
Do you sometimes see yourself, you are specifically speaking for the dead?
Yeah, I do. I do feel that, actually. And I feel like sometimes I can relate to them in a strange way, in a nice way, not a macabre way, but they're waiting for something to happen so that their life and their death wasn't in vain.